Have you ever wondered what those floaty flower things over Bikini Bottom actually are? Are they just some quirky design to make the place look pretty and fancy? Or is there something else going on here? These are the questions that very few people have ever asked, but the conclusion to our theory will answer all of them. Get ready for the weirdest SpongeBob theory you've heard in a while. This is the pollution theory. Everybody knows that applying logic to SpongeBob SquarePants is pretty pointless. It's a show about a talking sponge.
Hi, how are you?
But honestly, there's just so much of the show that's worth talking about that any theory is worth delving into. Well, today's theory will dig into some of the background lore of Bikini Bottom that you never knew existed. Partly because it doesn't really exist, but even theories deserve to be tested. Let's get going. In every single episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, the sky of Bikini Bottom is shown to be a beautiful blue ocean with what looks to be floating flowers. Now, these are generally considered to be clouds, just like our world, which makes sense, but what if I told you that these weren't actually clouds, but propellers from boats or possibly submarines? Honestly, it makes total sense when you really stop to think about it. If you take a look at boat propellers, they all have similar properties to the floating flowers in Bikini Bottom. They all have 3 to 5 leaves or blades, and some of them even have the kind of groovy, imperfect design that these clouds have too. And let's not forget that we're talking about an underwater world here. So if there was going to be any place for boat propellers, it's definitely under the sea. But let's address something I think you're going to ask about. Why are they so colorful? Why are they so blurry? Okay, we'll come back to the blurriness later, but let's focus on the color thing for now. Honestly, it's a pretty easy thing to explain. Algae. Algae is a kind of underwater plant that grows based on sunlight and nutrients. You'll often see it growing on rocks that have been underwater for a long time, and more often than not, it's extremely colorful. Usually it's green, but there have been unique blue, red, and brown algae found in the world. So if you think of them as propellers, it's highly likely that they would have become something of a breeding ground for algae. That means they're just a natural thing, and the residents of Bikini Bottom think they look pretty. Of course, it could also just be a simple trick of the light making the colors change. I don't think it really matters how the propellers became this color, but I think it makes more sense for them to simply be abandoned rather than magical floating flowers. Let's get an example and try to prove this. In the episode Karen's Virus, Plankton's computer wife Karen hangs out with a sick computer and gets herself sick in the process. Determined to save her, Plankton reaches out to SpongeBob, believing him stupid enough to help. He transports SpongeBob inside Karen to defeat the virus. Throughout the episode, the virus eats at Karen's programming, making her act in ways that are unusual and out of character for her. But one particular moment sees her hurling a car into the sky right at one of the sky flowers, and when it makes contact, it knocks the flower out of the sky. Now, if that was just a simple cloud like in our world, there's no way the flower would fall, let alone shatter. It would have to have something tangible and solid to knock it out. And I mean, when we really think about it, the flowers are all different sizes, suggesting that some are closer than others, but they're never right beside one another or overlapping like real clouds. And I think this could be because the boats or subs couldn't really be that close without colliding. And it happens again in the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water. The movie opens with Plankton attacking the Krusty Krab to steal the Krabby Patty formula. But after fiendishly fooling Mr. Krabs, Plankton manages to do it, leaving a false document in its place. But when SpongeBob and Plankton fight over it, the secret formula suddenly vanishes, leaving the residents of Bikini Bottom without their beloved Krabby Patties. Bikini Bottom turns into a weird kind of apocalyptic wasteland, and we see one of the flower clouds drop. Here's what else is so interesting about this. When Bikini Bottom turns apocalyptic, you can see the clouds moving in a way they never do in the show, but they don't move horizontally like our clouds do. They seem like they're sinking, which again is something that implies they have a little bit of weight to them, like propellers. And even in Sponge on the Run, which is not the greatest SpongeBob movie, I'll admit, the opening shot even show one of these flower clouds embedded in the sand, and it's pretty obviously not a cloud. So unless unless they built a sculpture dedicated to this thing, I think we have our answer. Now, I think the propeller theory makes a lot of sense, but you could also possibly argue that the propellers have just been abandoned in the Pacific Ocean. Stephen Hillenburg said he came up with the idea for the show when he was trying to think of an idea that could raise awareness of ocean health, so it would make sense. And would you believe me if I said the Bikini Bottom is extremely, unthinkably polluted? One of the theories online suggests that the clouds might not be propellers at all, but remnants of some kind of pollution. I mean, think about it. When a city is extremely polluted and full of smoke and fumes, light tends to refract in strange ways, creating new and interesting images and shapes. Things become distorted and unfamiliar despite being things we might see every single day. And when you're at the bottom of the ocean, it makes sense that the same thing would be happening on a more common level. Besides, does a talking sponge and a starfish know that this kind of thing isn't normal? Probably not. That also explains why some of the shapes are so unique and strange. They're likely all more or less the same design but being refracted through the toxicity in the water. But what if it really isn't anything to do with propellers or boats? What if we're just looking at pure pollution itself? How would that even make sense? Actually, it makes a lot of sense when you consider that Bikini Bottom is inspired by a real place with a controversial history. In the episode SB-129, SpongeBob annoys Squidward so much with his demands to play that Squidward hides himself in the freezer. But when SpongeBob leaves him alone, Squidward realizes he's locked himself inside, forced to wait for someone to find him.
2,000 years later.
The door finally opens and Squidward discovers that his savior is Spongetron, a robotic descendant of SpongeBob. Honestly, it's best if you don't really think about it too much. Anyway, Spongetron throws Squidward out and offers him a chance to go back to his own period of history in a time machine. But Squidward instead decides he's going to go back to a time before SpongeBob was ever born. He ends up traveling so far back that he finds nobody else and enjoys the peace. But then a primitive sponge and starfish arrive, and you can guess how that goes. What's interesting here is that we're getting a look at the original Bikini Bottom, and if you look at the sky, you'll see that there are no flower clouds anywhere. It's pure, uncivilized wilderness. This suggests that something must have happened that would have cleaned this place up enough to create an entire atoll at the bottom. Well, yeah, Stephen Hillenburg has confirmed that Bikini Bottom was at least inspired by, and is believed to be underneath, the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Now, if you happen to know anything about Bikini Atoll, you know why that's so interesting. But if you don't, let me briefly explain. Back during the days of World War II, the United States military began using the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean as a nuclear testing site.
You think they're just cartoons, bright colors, silly jokes, harmless adventures. But what if that's only the surface? What if something darker is hiding behind the laughter? Abandoned cities beneath the ocean, where the sky isn't made of clouds at all. Radiation that created strange beings who believe they're normal. Families living in a world that already ended, pretending everything is fine. Every episode isn't just a story, it's a clue, a trace of catastrophe, a world after the apocalypse, carefully disguised as childhood nostalgia. The signs were always there. In the background, the silence, and the details no one questioned. Are you ready to see what was hidden in plain sight? Welcome to the theories that change your childhood forever. Subscribe if you're ready to see the truth.
However, the amount and scale of the testing was so intense that the creatures within died pretty quickly due to the nuclear contamination in the water. Even today, Bikini Atoll remains one of the most contaminated bodies of water on the planet, uninhabitable for many of the animals on this planet. And I think, in a way, that makes the show work even better. It definitely explains why we have all these talking animals who thrive on fast food and seemingly nothing else. I mean, think about it. SpongeBob himself is designed to look like a kitchen sponge, which doesn't really make a lot of sense unless you imagine he was just some castaway piece of trash that ended up in the ocean. He himself is a piece of pollution, something Squidward would absolutely agree with, by the way, but he's a piece of waste that has been brought to life by the remnants of this nuclear testing. You can also look at Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, two human characters who seem to have the impossible ability to breathe underwater and talk to fish. I mean, there's no way you can do that unless you've somehow been given superhuman abilities, and the theory goes that these two are Navy divers who got caught up in the Bikini Atoll testing. I mean, let's not think about how that happened or why, but, well, I never really stopped to think about how they survived down there until now, and I guess this does make more sense. But let's look back to the colorful pollution flowers. A few years ago, there was a theory floating around on social media that linked the pollution theory to the regular oil spills we see in the news, and the comparison is surprisingly believable. A quick Google search will show you a whole bunch of unbelievable images of oil spilling into bodies of water and creating these unique, colorful patterns that are completely alien to nature. Try to tell me they don't look similar to the so-called flower clouds of Bikini Bottom. And I think it would make sense that nuclear testing and the dropping of bombs would undoubtedly leave behind a lot of mess. Am I suggesting that the clouds of Bikini Bottom are toxic oil spills gradually sinking down over the residents? Yes, that is exactly what I'm suggesting. Oil companies are killing the residents of Bikini Bottom. While the propeller theory is pretty solid and would make sense, this one makes even more sense to me, especially given that the clouds are shown to be able to move and shift with the changing of the water. I guess the only downside to the theory is that it doesn't make a lot of sense as to how they were able to fall when Karen threw the car at it. But as for the rest of the theory, I could buy it entirely. And honestly, I would not be surprised if Stephen Hillenburg did intend Bikini Bottom to be the leftover remnants of a nuclear testing site.
Welcome to the apocalypse, Mr. Squidward. I hope you like leather.
I mean, if you wanted to make a show that was promoting ocean health, then setting it in the brutal aftermath of a bomb site makes total sense. Thankfully, he found a way to make it look way better than that sounds. But I honestly think it makes the show more interesting to consider it in this light, that the residents of Bikini Bottom have been created in the aftermath of nuclear testing. It's not quite as violent or terrifying a story as Godzilla, but it makes the show seem more optimistic somehow. Even after all the chaos and disaster, there will always be this little atoll on the bottom of the ocean, flipping burgers and throwing cars at one another. The flower clouds will continue floating above them no matter what. Or maybe they're just floating flowers in an underwater atoll full of talking, fast food-loving fish. I don't know, man. I just like cartoons.